The iron gate clanged shut with a finality that echoed across the frozen prairie like the last note of a funeral hymn. Delphina Ashworth stood alone in the bitter December wind, watching as two men from the bank nailed the foreclosure notice to the door of the house she had built with her husband over 7 long years. The house with its whitewashed clapboard siding that Ezra had painted twice each summer. The house with glass windows they had freighted in from St. Louis at a cost that had made her gasp when she first heard the figure. The house with the stone fireplace where she had hung her grandmother's copper kettle, where she had sat with Ezra on winter evenings reading aloud to each other while the fire crackled and popped. All of it gone now. Harlan Marsh, the banker, adjusted his spectacles against the bitter wind. He was a thin man with thin lips and eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. He held the documents in gloved hands, papers that reduced 7 years of dreams and labor to columns of numbers and legal phrases. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying no warmth despite the formal courtesy, "you have until sundown to vacate the premises. The barn, as discussed, remains yours since it sits on the adjoining parcel you purchased separately before your marriage. But the house, the land it stands on, the livestock, the equipment, all of it belongs to the bank now." Delphina said nothing. 3 days had passed since the final notice arrived with its red wax seal and its cold language of default and forfeiture. 3 days since she had read it by candlelight, hoping she had misunderstood. 3 days since she had finally accepted that 3 consecutive years of drought had taken everything, that the winter had come early and fierce, and that she stood now trapped between impossible debts and an unforgiving sky. In all that time, she had not spoken a word. Not to the neighbors who came to offer hollow condolences. Not to the minister who spoke of God's mysterious ways. Not even to Copper, the old hunting dog who followed her everywhere and watched her with worried eyes. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her sewing basket. Inside it lay her mother's Bible, a few spools of thread, needles wrapped in cloth, and the small leather journal where Ezra had written poetry he never showed anyone but her. These were the things she had chosen to save. These and the worn toolbox that sat at her feet, the one Ezra had used for every repair and improvement on this land. "Do you understand, Mrs. Ashworth?" She understood. She understood that her husband had died of pneumonia 3 months ago, coughing and gasping in the night, while she held his hand and prayed for a miracle that never came. She understood that she had faced the creditors alone, had negotiated and pleaded and sold everything she could sell, and still it had not been enough. She understood that at 50 years old, she was now a widow with nothing but a hay barn, a sewing basket, and a dog. "I understand," she said. Her voice came out steady, surprising her. She had always been steady. Ezra used to say it was what he loved most about her, that calm center that held firm no matter what storms raged around them. Copper pressed against her leg, his graying muzzle lifted toward her face. The old hunting dog had been Ezra's companion for 9 years, and now he was hers. He whined softly, sensing her distress in the way dogs always do. "Come, Copper," she said quietly. "We need to go." She did not look back at the house as she walked away. She could not bear to see the windows she had polished so carefully, the door Ezra had carved with a pattern of wheat sheaves to celebrate their first good harvest, the porch where they had sat together watching summer sunsets paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. She walked toward the hay barn, a quarter-mile distant across frozen ground. The wind cut through her wool coat like a blade of ice. Her boots crunched against the frost-hardened earth. Beside her, Copper's breath misted in small clouds that dissipated almost as soon as they formed. The barn loomed ahead, a massive structure that Ezra had built 3 summers ago when the harvests were still good. 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with walls of rough-hewn timber and a steeply pitched roof designed to shed the heavy snows of Nebraska winters. Inside, she knew, it was still half full from the summer cutting. Great mounds of prairie hay they had managed to put up before the drought had fully set in. Hay they had planned to sell or feed to livestock they no longer owned. Hay that might now be the only thing standing between her and freezing to death. The sun was beginning its descent as she reached the barn, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of copper and dying rose. The colors reminded her of her name, of her father calling her his little Delphina when she was a girl in Pennsylvania, of summers that seemed impossibly distant now. She pulled open the large barn doors, and she and Copper stepped inside. The temperature within was perhaps 10 degrees warmer than outside. The hay itself generated a subtle heat as it slowly dried and decomposed, and the thick walls blocked the worst of the wind. But 10 degrees warmer than freezing was still deadly cold. Delphina set down her sewing basket and looked around the cavernous space. In the fading light filtering through gaps in the wallboards, she could see her breath misting in clouds. She could see the mountains of hay, the dusty floor, the vast emptiness that surrounded her. For the first time since the final notice had arrived, tears began to slip down her weathered cheeks. She allowed herself to weep for exactly 1 minute. She counted the seconds in her head, a habit from childhood when her mother had told her that grief needed expression, but not dominion. 60 seconds of tears, hot against her cold skin. 60 seconds of acknowledging the magnitude of what she had lost. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and spoke aloud to the empty barn. "No," she said, her voice finding strength with each word. "No, I will not weep. Weeping will not keep me warm. Weeping will not put food in my belly or a roof over my head." Copper looked up at her, his tail giving a tentative wag at the sound of her voice. "We need to think," she told him. "We need to think like we have never thought before." She looked at the hay surrounding her. Mountains of it, hundreds of bales stacked and waiting. She walked to the nearest pile and pressed her hand against the compressed grass. It was dry, tightly bound, surprisingly dense. And then, like a door opening in her mind, she remembered. Her father, Gideon Stokes of Pennsylvania. A practical man, a farmer, a builder who could make something useful from almost nothing. She had been 12 years old when he built the hay house. The memory came flooding back with a vividness that made her catch her breath. Her father standing in their barn, surrounded by hay bales just like these. His voice, patient and instructive, explaining what he was doing and why. "Watch carefully, Delphina," he had said. "Each of these stems is hollow, filled with air. An air that cannot move is one of the best insulators God ever created. Stack these bales like bricks, seal them with mud plaster, and you will have the warmest house you have ever lived in." She had watched him build it. She had helped carry the smaller bales, had mixed the mud plaster with her own small hands, had seen the structure rise from nothing into something solid and real. And when it was finished, she had stood inside with her father while a winter storm howled outside, and she had marveled at the warmth. "Father," she whispered now, 50 years old and standing in a Nebraska barn with nothing left to lose. "Father, I remember." She walked to the nearest bale and examined it carefully. 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, a foot and a half thick, tightly bound with twine. She tested its weight, lifting one end, perhaps 60 pounds, heavy but manageable. She looked up at the vast space of the barn and an idea began to form. Not a house outside, exposed to the wind and weather. A house inside, a structure within a structure. Use the barn's walls as the outer protection and build the hay house within, create an insulated room inside the room. 8 feet by 10 feet, she said aloud, pacing out the dimensions in her mind, big enough for a bed, a small stove, a table, high enough to stand up in, 7 feet at the lowest point of the ceiling. Copper watched her, his head tilted in that questioning way dogs have. "We do not have a stove," she admitted to him, "but we have the toolbox, and I can trade work in town for one. There is always work for someone who knows carpentry, even a woman. Ezra taught me well." She took a deep breath of the cold air, feeling it burn her lungs, feeling something else kindle in her chest. Not hope exactly, something fiercer, determination, defiance, the refusal to surrender to circumstances that wanted her dead. "We have tonight to get through first," she said. "Can we build walls tonight? Enough to block the wind?" She picked up the toolbox and opened it. Inside were the tools that had built a homestead, that had repaired 1,000 broken things, that had shaped wood and metal into usefulness. Hammers and saws, planes and chisels, awls and files. And twine, lengths of sturdy twine that could bind things together. "We can try," she said, and she began to build. She worked through the dying light and into the darkness, building by feel when the last rays of sun faded and left her in blackness, relieved only by the faint starlight that seeped through gaps in the barn walls. Her hands, calloused from years of farm work, found their rhythm quickly. Lift each bale, position it carefully. Check the alignment by running her fingers along the edges. Stagger them, she murmured, remembering her father's instructions from so long ago. Like bricklaying, each bale has to overlap the joint below it by at least half its length. That way there is no straight line of weakness running from bottom to top. She cut lengths of twine and threaded them through the natural bindings of each bale, lashing adjacent bales together. Her fingers fumbled at first in the cold and darkness, but she persisted, pulling each knot tight until her hands ached. "I never thought I would be building a house in the dark," she said to Copper, who lay nearby, watching her work with patient eyes. Or building it from hay, for that matter. She built 3 walls first, placing them in the far corner of the barn where she would have 2 existing timber walls to anchor against. She drove wooden stakes into the ground at the corners, tying the hay bales to these anchors to prevent the walls from shifting. By midnight, she had created a 3-sided enclosure 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, with walls 3 bales high, 4.5 feet tall, enough to block the wind when she sat or lay down. She stepped back to examine her work by the faint light of the moon rising through the gaps in the barn roof. Then she pressed her hand against the outside of the hay wall, climbed over it, and pressed her hand against the inside. The temperature difference was already noticeable, perhaps 5 or 6 degrees warmer on the interior side. "Copper," she said, wonder creeping into her voice. "It is working already. The hay is trapping heat, my heat, inside." She worked for another hour, adding a 4th wall to close off the enclosure, leaving only a small opening for a doorway. She hung a piece of canvas over this opening, one she had found in the corner of the barn, tucking the edges around the hay bales to seal out the wind. Then she spread the wool blanket from her basket on the floor inside her hay fortress and called Copper to lie beside her. She pulled her coat tight and covered them both with another piece of canvas she had salvaged. Around them, the hay walls blocked the vicious wind that moaned through the barn. The air inside the small enclosure was still cold, but it was still air, dead air, and their combined body heat began to warm the tiny space. Delphina closed her eyes. She was not dead. She was not going to die tonight. Tomorrow she would continue building. Tomorrow she would find a way to survive. For the first time since Ezra's death, she slept without nightmares. If you are enjoying this story so far, take a moment to think about what you would do in Delphina's situation. Would you have the courage to build a house from hay in the middle of a Nebraska winter? Comment below with your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Morning came gray and bitter, but Delphina woke to a revelation. She was alive. She was not suffering from frostbite. The simple hay enclosure she had built in desperation had kept her and Copper through a night when the temperature outside had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. She sat up, her breath still misting in the cold air, and looked at the walls she had built. They were crude, unfinished, gaps showing between some of the bales. But they had worked. They had held back the killing cold long enough for her body heat to make the small space survivable. "Father was right," she said softly, running her hand along the hay. "All those hollow stems, all that trapped air." She had work to do. She left Copper in the enclosure and walked the 4 miles to the town of Hickory Ridge. The wind cut at her face the entire way, but she kept her head down and her feet moving, one step after another, the way you survive anything that seems impossible. She found work immediately, though not without struggle. A widow asking for carpentry jobs raised eyebrows and drew skeptical looks. But the miller's wagon needed repairs, and no one else was available, and Delphina knew wagons as well as any man in the county. Ezra had made sure of that. "You certain you can handle this?" the miller asked, looking at her with doubt plain on his face. "I am certain," she said. She had the wagon fixed by noon. The miller paid her $2 and, impressed despite himself, threw in a sack of cornmeal. It was the first kindness she had received since Ezra's death, and it nearly broke her careful composure. At the general store, she found what she needed: a second-hand wood stove, small and dented but functional, with a chimney pipe included. The storekeeper wanted $10 for it. "I can pay you 2 now," Delphina said, keeping her voice steady. and I will work off the rest. Anything you need built or fixed." Thaddeus Pettigrew, the storekeeper, was a shrewd man who knew everyone's business in the county. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her worn coat, her calloused hands, the determined set of her jaw. "Heard about your troubles," he said finally. "Heard Marsh took everything but your barn." "That is right. What are you going to do?" "Survive the winter," Delphina said simply. "Then figure out spring." Pettigrew nodded slowly. "I have a storage shed that needs building. Do that for me and the stove is yours, but I will need it done by the end of January." They shook hands, and Delphina borrowed a hand cart to haul the stove and pipe back to the barn. It was a long 4 miles, pushing that cart through frozen ruts and icy patches, but she made it before dark. Over the next 3 days, she transformed her crude shelter into something more substantial. She added course after course of hay bales, the walls rising higher with each layer. 6 bales high, 9 feet tall. She left gaps for a doorway and for the stovepipe that would eventually pierce the ceiling. Then came the ceiling itself, the most challenging part of the construction. She built a temporary wooden framework from scrap lumber she found in the barn, using it to support the hay bales while she positioned them overhead. It was exhausting work, dangerous work, standing on stacked bales and lifting 60-pound weights above her head, checking constantly to ensure nothing would collapse inward. "What if it falls?" she asked herself aloud, eyeing the heavy bales suspended above her. But she had watched her father do this. She knew the engineering. The bales interlocked. The weight of each one helped hold the others in place. Once they were all positioned and tied, the structure would be self-supporting. She was right. As the final ceiling bales locked into position, she felt the whole structure settle and stabilize. The temporary wooden supports were no longer bearing any weight. They could be removed. The hay house, crude as it was, had become a solid, self-supporting structure. Then came the delicate work of installing the stove. Delphina positioned the small cast-iron stove in the corner of her hay house, the corner farthest from the doorway to maximize heat distribution. She carefully fed the chimney pipe up through the gap she had left, then through a hole she cut in the barn's roof with her handsaw. This was the most dangerous part of the entire enterprise. Metal stovepipe, when hot, could easily ignite dry hay. She knew this. She had heard stories of barn fires started by careless placement of heating stoves, fires that consumed everything in minutes and left nothing but ash and regret. She took extraordinary precautions. First, she cleared a 3-foot circle around the stove location, removing all loose hay and sweeping the dirt floor clean. Then she laid a foundation of stones she had gathered from the frozen creek bed, creating a non-combustible base for the stove to sit on. Next came the critical work of sealing the gap around the chimney pipe where it passed through the hay ceiling. She mixed mud with water she had melted from snow, adding chopped hay to the mixture to create a primitive form of adobe. She packed this mud mixture around the pipe, creating a thick barrier 6 inches in all directions between the hot metal and the combustible hay. "This mud will dry and harden," she told Copper, who watched her work with patient attention. "It will protect the hay from the heat of the pipe, but I will need to check it regularly, especially in the first few weeks. Any cracks that form need to be filled immediately." She paused, looking at what she had created. "And if there is a fire," she said quietly, "then I get out fast and let it burn. This house has saved my life, but it is not worth dying for. I can always build another." And when the stove was in place and the chimney properly sealed, she stood back and looked at what she had created. From the outside, it resembled a large rectangular haystack, 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 9 feet tall, sitting in the corner of the barn. But inside, when she crawled through the small doorway, it was a room. Rough and basic, but a room nonetheless. She struck a match and lit the kindling in the stove. The flame caught, small at first, then growing as it found the dry wood she had gathered. Within minutes, heat began to radiate into the space. She watched nervously at first, worried that the hay would somehow catch fire despite all her precautions. But the bales themselves, so tightly packed, were surprisingly resistant to burning. The fire in the stove stayed in the stove, and its warmth began to fill the room. She had salvaged a thermometer from the barn's tack room, a simple mercury instrument the previous owner had used to monitor hay storage conditions. She hung it on the wall. 32 degrees, she announced to Copper. Above freezing. An hour later, she checked it again. 45 degrees from one small fire. By evening, the thermometer read 58 degrees. Outside, according to the thermometer still hanging in the barn's main space, it was 11 degrees below zero, a 69-degree difference, created by walls of grass and a small fire. "It works," she whispered, removing her coat for the first time in days. "Ezra, it works." She sat at a makeshift table she had fashioned from scrap lumber, eating cornmeal mush cooked on the stovetop, and for the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to feel something other than grief and fear. She felt proud. She felt capable. She felt alive. That night, she named her strange little dwelling. She thought of all the words that might describe it: shelter, refuge, haven, but none of them captured what it truly meant to her. "Providence House," she said finally, speaking the words into the warm air. "Because that is what this is, making wise use of what I have been given, even when it seemed like I had been given nothing." Copper thumped his tail against the floor, as if approving her choice. Providence House. It would do. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when that word concerns something as unusual as a widow building a house from hay. Orrin Hensley was the first to come. He arrived on the 5th day after Delphina had completed her basic structure, riding up to the barn on a gray mare with his coat collar turned up against the wind. Orrin was 55 years old, a man who had homesteaded this land for 3 decades and considered himself an authority on survival in Nebraska winters. He did not knock. He simply pushed open the barn doors and walked in, looking around until he spotted the strange structure in the corner. "Mrs. Ashworth?" he called out. Delphina emerged from her hay house, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been plastering the interior walls with more mud mixture, creating a smooth surface that would not shed chaff and dust. "Mr. Hensley," she said calmly. He walked around her structure, examining it with the critical eye of a man who has built many things and seen many more fail. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something that looked very much like pity. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said finally, "you have lost your mind along with your husband. Building a house from hay? You will freeze to death in there, or burn alive. Either way, you will be dead before spring." Delphina said nothing. She had expected this reaction. She had prepared herself for it. "I have lived here 30 years, Orrin continued, his voice rising with conviction. 30 years, and I have never seen anyone try something this foolish. Hay is for feeding cattle, not for building houses. It will rot. It will collapse. It will catch fire from that stove you have got in there." "I understand your concern," Delphina said quietly. "Do you?" "Because I am not sure you do." He gestured broadly at the hay walls. "This is not building, Mrs. Ashworth. This is desperation. And desperation makes people do stupid things that get them killed." "Perhaps you are right." Her calm response seemed to frustrate him more than an argument would have. "I'm trying to help you," he said. "The church has funds for widows in distress. You could stay with the Whitmore family until spring. There are options that do not involve dying in a pile of hay." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hensley. Truly I do, but I believe this will work." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You will see," he said. "When the real cold comes, when we get a proper blizzard, you will see how foolish this is. And I hope to God you come to your senses before then." He left without another word, and Delphina returned to her plastering. But Orrin Hensley was only the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, they came in a steady stream. The curious, the concerned, the contemptuous. Word had spread through Hickory Ridge and beyond, and everyone wanted to see the crazy widow and her hay house. Dr. Phineas Fairbanks arrived on the 8th day. He was the town physician, a man of education and science who prided himself on rational thinking. He walked around the structure 3 times, pressed his hand against the walls, peered at the mud plaster with a furrowed brow. "Fascinating construction," he said, his tone clinical, "but ultimately impractical. The insulating properties of loose hay are well documented, but compressed bales like these? The density defeats the purpose. You would be better off with a proper wooden cabin." "I do not have the money for a proper wooden cabin," Delphina said. "No, I suppose you do not." He adjusted his spectacles and looked at her with an expression that seemed more pitying than hostile. Mrs. Ashworth, I mean no offense, but have you considered that your grief may be affecting your judgment? Losing a spouse can do strange things to the mind. Perhaps you should speak with Reverend Whitmore. My judgment is fine, Dr. Fairbanks. Is it? Because from where I stand, a woman building a house from hay looks very much like someone who has lost touch with reality. He left, and Delphina added another layer of mud plaster to her walls. Reverend Josiah Whitmore came the following Sunday after services. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a gentle voice that had comforted many a grieving parishioner over the years. His wife Cordelia accompanied him, carrying a basket of bread and preserves. Mrs. Ashworth, the Reverend said, looking around at her creation with an expression of benevolent confusion, we have been praying for you. I appreciate that, Reverend. This is quite an undertaking. He touched the hay wall gingerly as if it might crumble at his touch. I must confess, I have never seen anything quite like it. My father built something similar in Pennsylvania when I was a girl. It kept us warm through many winters. The Reverend nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he remained unconvinced. Perhaps we should pray for your safety as well as your soul. The winter here is not like Pennsylvania, Mrs. Ashworth. The cold can be unforgiving. Cordelia Whitmore pressed the basket into Delphina's hands. Please take this, and please know that our home is always open to you. You do not have to stay in this. She trailed off, unable to find a word that was not insulting. Thank you, Delphina said. Both of you, your kindness means more than you know. But she did not leave. She stayed and continued building, improving, reinforcing. Cornelius Blackwood came on a Tuesday, arriving in a fine carriage that looked absurdly out of place in front of a hay barn. He was the wealthiest landowner in the county, a man who had made his fortune buying up the claims of failed homesteaders and reselling them to new waves of hopeful settlers. He did not bother to examine the hay house. He barely glanced at it before turning to Delphina with a look of thinly veiled contempt. I heard Marsh only took the house and the good land, he said. This barn parcel is still yours, is it not? It is. I will give you $50 for it. Cash. You can take that money and go somewhere civilized. Start over. $50 is more than fair for a hay barn and a few acres of useless ground. It is not for sale, Mr. Blackwood. His eyes narrowed. Everything is for sale, Mrs. Ashworth. The only question is the price. Then my price is higher than you are willing to pay. He left angry, his carriage wheels throwing up frozen mud as it pulled away. Delphina watched him go and felt a small flame of satisfaction burning in her chest. Young Wayland Tanner came with a group of friends, all of them in their 20s, all of them loud and dismissive. They walked around the hay house laughing, making jokes, slapping the walls to see if they would fall. $20 says she does not last till January, Wayland announced loudly. I will take that bet, one of his friends replied. Make it 30. She will not last till Christmas. They left laughing, and Delphina kept working. Prudence Olson came with sympathy that felt more like pity. She was a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business, and she had been spreading the story of the hay house to anyone who would listen. Poor thing, she said, shaking her head sadly as she looked at Delphina's creation. First your husband, now your sanity. It is such a tragedy. I am not insane, Mrs. Olson. Of course you are not, dear. Of course you are not. Her tone made it clear she believed exactly the opposite. Through it all, Delphina worked and said little. When they mocked her, she stayed silent. When they offered advice, she thanked them politely. When they predicted her death, she simply nodded and returned to her labor. She remembered something Ezra had told her once, something his own father had taught him. When people do not believe in what you are doing, do not waste your breath arguing. Just finish building. The results will speak louder than any words ever could. She was finishing her building. But there was one visitor who was different from all the others. Old Greta Lindqvist came on the coldest day of December, a day when the wind howled and the snow fell sideways, and no sane person would venture out without dire necessity. She was 75 years old, a Swedish immigrant who had come to Nebraska as a young bride and had survived more winters than anyone else in the county. She walked into the barn slowly, her ancient joints protesting every step. She looked at the hay house for a long time without speaking. Then she walked up to it, removed her glove, and pressed her bare hand against the wall. A smile spread across her weathered face. Halmbale, she said softly. In Sweden, this is what we called it. My grandmother lived in one. She lived to be 92. Delphina felt tears prick her eyes. Finally, someone who understood. Your grandmother, she said. She built it herself? With her own hands, after my grandfather died in the war. Greta turned to look at Delphina with eyes that had seen much and judged little. They laughed at her too, said she was a crazy old woman who would die in her hay pile. She outlived all of them. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Greta reached out and took Delphina's hand in her own. Keep building, she said. Do not listen to the fools. Keep building. She left as quietly as she had come, and Delphina stood in her hay house with tears streaming down her face and hope blazing in her heart like a flame that no amount of doubt could extinguish. Right now, Delphina's hay house is working. It is keeping her warm while her neighbors shake their heads and predict disaster. But a storm is coming, the worst storm Nebraska has ever seen. Do you think her strange little house will survive? Hit that like button if you believe in Delphina, and subscribe to find out what happens when the great blizzard arrives. January arrived with teeth of ice and a bitter wind that seemed to blow straight from the Arctic. Delphina had used the weeks of relative calm to improve her hay house in ways both practical and comforting. She had plastered all the interior walls with her mud mixture, creating smooth surfaces that glowed amber in the lamplight. She had built shelves from scrap lumber and organized her meager possessions with care. She had sewn blankets from empty grain sacks, stuffing them with loose hay to create bedding that was surprisingly warm and soft. She had fashioned curtains from burlap to hang over the doorway, adding another layer of insulation. She had even created decorative wall hangings by weaving prairie grass into intricate patterns, determined to make this place feel like a home rather than just a refuge. The thermometer on the wall told a story of success. When the temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero, the temperature inside her hay house remained above 50 degrees. She burned a quarter of the firewood that a conventional cabin would require. The walls held their warmth with remarkable tenacity, releasing it slowly through the long, cold nights. Visitors still came, though less frequently now that the initial curiosity had faded. Most still shook their heads and predicted doom. But Delphina noticed that their voices carried less certainty than before. They could see with their own eyes that she was not dead, was not freezing, was not suffering the fate they had so confidently predicted. Friedrich Brenner, a German farmer from the next section over, came to examine her construction with genuine interest rather than mockery. He walked around the structure 3 times, ran his hands over the mud-plastered walls, pressed his ear against the hay to listen to the silence within. In the old country, he said, we sometimes use straw for insulation in the roof spaces, but to build an entire house from it. He shook his head in wonder rather than dismissal. How much firewood do you burn? A quarter of what I would need for a regular cabin this size, Delphina told him. A quarter. He repeated the word as if tasting it. That is remarkable. It is the trapped air, she explained simply. Friedrich, you understand insulation. You know why this works. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Like a down blanket, the feathers trap air, and the air traps heat. Exactly. He left with a thoughtful expression on his face, and Delphina felt a small glow of vindication. At least one person had listened with an open mind. But that same afternoon, another visitor arrived, one who brought no curiosity, no sympathy, and no open mind. Harlan Marsh came in a black carriage, his thin face pinched against the cold, his spectacles fogging as he stepped from the heated interior into the frozen air. He walked into the barn as if he owned it, which, Delphina reminded herself with a flash of anger, he did not. Mrs. Ashworth, he said, his voice carrying that same cold formality it had held on the day he took her home. I see you have been busy. Mr. Marsh, what brings you here? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked around her hay house, examining it with an expression that mixed contempt with calculation. Finally, he turned to face her. I have been reviewing the property records, he said. There appears to be some ambiguity regarding the boundary between your parcel and the land the bank now owns. Delphina felt ice form in her stomach that had nothing to do with the January cold. "There is no ambiguity," she said carefully. "I purchased this parcel before my marriage. It has always been separate from the homestead." "Perhaps, but the survey markers are unclear. It is possible that this barn sits on land that rightfully belongs to the bank." He smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. "Which would mean that all of this hay also belongs to the bank. Hay that could be sold to help offset your remaining debts." "I have the deed," Delphina said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I have the original survey documents. This land is mine, Mr. Marsh. It has always been mine. Documents can be challenged, surveys can be reinterpreted. They can, but they will not be, not successfully." She walked to her hay house, reached inside, and retrieved a leather folder she had kept safe since the day of the foreclosure. "My father was a careful man, Mr. Marsh. He insisted I keep separate records of everything I owned before marriage. This deed is in my maiden name, dated 3 years before I married Ezra Ashworth. The survey was conducted by the territorial government and filed in Lincoln. You may challenge it if you wish, but you will lose." Marsh's expression flickered, the first crack in his composure she had ever seen. "Let me see those documents." "No," she tucked the folder back inside her hay house. "You may request copies from the Territorial Records Office, but these originals stay with me." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Marsh's lip curled into something that was almost a sneer. "This is not over, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "When that ridiculous hay pile of yours collapses, do not come crawling to me. When you freeze or burn or starve, do not expect sympathy from anyone in this town. You have made your choice. Now you will live with the consequences." "Or die with them?" Delphina asked quietly. "Is that what you are hoping for?" He did not answer. He turned and walked back to his carriage, his black coat flapping in the bitter wind. The carriage pulled away, its wheels crunching against the frozen ground, and Delphina watched it go with her heart pounding and her hands trembling. She had won this battle. But she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like the cold itself that Marsh would not forgive this humiliation. He would be waiting, watching, hoping for her failure. She went back into her hay house and sat on her bed, copper pressing close against her legs. The next morning, old Greta Lindqvist returned, moving more slowly than usual, her ancient face creased with worry. "I did not come for a social visit," she said without preamble. "I came to warn you, and I am not leaving until the danger passes." "Warn me about what?" Greta looked toward the west, toward a sky that had taken on a peculiar yellow-gray color Delphina had never seen before. "My bones know things," the old woman said. "They have known things for 75 years. And right now they are telling me that something terrible is coming. Worse than anything I have seen in 50 years of Nebraska winters." Delphina followed her gaze. The sky did look strange, and Copper had been restless all morning, whining and refusing to go outside, pressing against her legs whenever she stood still. "How long until it arrives?" "A day, maybe 2. Greta's voice was heavy with certainty. "Make sure you have enough food, enough wood, enough water. And when it comes, do not go outside. Not for anything. Not for anyone." Delphina spent the rest of that day and the next preparing. She filled every container she could find with snow to melt for water. She stacked firewood beside the stove until there was barely room to move. She cooked beans and cornmeal, storing the prepared food where the cold would preserve it, but her body heat would keep it from freezing solid. Greta helped where she could, though her aged body limited what she could do. Mostly she sat in the corner, watching Delphina work, offering advice born of decades of surviving on the prairie. "You have built well," Greta said on the evening of January 8th. "Your father taught you true. This house will hold." "I hope you are right." "I am." Greta smiled, her weathered face creasing into 100 lines. "My bones know things, and right now they are telling me that this house will save more lives than just yours." That night the wind began to rise. "The storm is coming, the worst storm Nebraska has ever seen. Delphina is prepared, but is her hay house strong enough to survive what is about to happen? Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss the most dramatic part of this story. The storm announced itself on January 9th with a sound like the end of the world. Delphina had lived through Nebraska winters before. She had experienced blizzards that buried fences and stranded cattle and kept families homebound for days. She thought she knew what winter could do. She was wrong. This was not a blizzard. This was annihilation wrapped in white. The wind came first, a wall of force that slammed into the barn with enough power to make the timbers groan. Then the snow, but not snow as she knew it. This snow did not fall. It flew sideways, horizontal sheets of white that reduced visibility to nothing, that turned the air itself into a weapon. Within an hour, she could not see the barn doors from inside the barn. The gaps in the walls, which had let in starlight on clear nights, now let in nothing but howling wind and driving snow. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. Delphina retreated to her hay house with Greta and Copper, sealing the burlap curtain tight around the doorway. She fed the stove and checked the thermometer. Outside the hay house in the main barn space, the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. Inside the hay house, it held steady at 52 degrees. She sat on her bed with Copper pressed against her side and Greta hunched near the stove and listened to the storm rage. The sound was like nothing she had ever heard, a constant roar punctuated by shrieks of wind that sounded almost human. The barn creaked and groaned, its timbers protesting against forces they had never been designed to withstand. "I have heard storms before," Greta said quietly, "but never one that sounded so angry." Day passed into night, though they could only tell by Delphina's pocket watch. There was no difference in the darkness of outside her hay walls. The storm continued without pause, without mercy. Day 2, day 3. Delphina ventured out into the barn's main space once just to check the outer walls. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The thermometer in the barn read 35 below zero. She retreated to her hay house within minutes, her face burning, her fingers numb despite her gloves. The hay house held. The walls she had built, the walls her father had taught her to build, stood firm against the onslaught. The temperature inside remained livable. The stove burned steadily. Copper lay at her feet, warm and alive. Greta sat in her corner, ancient and calm, her bones having told her truly what was coming. But outside, beyond the barn, beyond the small circle of warmth she had created, the world was dying. She did not know this yet. She would not learn the full extent of the disaster until the storm finally passed. But she sensed it, in the terrible sound of the wind, in the complete absence of any other sign of life, in the way the storm seemed to go on forever without the slightest hint of weakening. On the fourth day, she heard something new, a pounding on the barn doors, faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind, but unmistakable. Someone was out there, someone was trying to get in. Every instinct screamed at her not to open those doors. Greta's warning echoed in her mind, do not go outside, not for anything, not for anyone. But she could not ignore that pounding. She could not sit in her warm hay house while someone froze to death 20 feet away. She wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned. She tied a rope around her waist and secured the other end to a post inside the barn. Then she fought her way to the barn doors, each step a battle against wind that seemed determined to knock her down. She lifted the latch and pushed. The door flew open and the storm reached inside with frozen fingers. Snow and wind filled the barn instantly, a chaos of white that stung her eyes and stole her breath. And there, barely visible through the maelstrom, were 3 figures huddled against the barn wall. She grabbed the nearest one and pulled with strength she did not know she possessed, hauling the figure inside. Went back for the second, the third. Then she slammed the door shut and dropped the latch, sealing out the storm. In the dim light of the barn, she saw who she had rescued. Orrin Hensley, the man who had called her mad. His wife Rowena, her face white with frostbite, barely conscious. And their son Ephraim, young and strong, but shaking so violently he could barely stand. "Please," Orrin gasped, his voice raw from cold and desperation. "Please, Mrs. Ashworth. Our house collapsed. The roof, the snow was too heavy. We have nowhere else." Delphina looked at the man who had predicted her death, who had told her she would freeze in her hay pile, who had urged her to abandon her foolish project and accept charity. She thought of all the things she could say, all the ways she could remind him of his mockery, his certainty, his contempt. Instead, she simply nodded toward her hay house. "Get inside," she said quickly before you freeze. Over the next 2 days, as the storm raged on with undiminished fury, more people came. They came stumbling through the white chaos, following rumors, following hope, following the simple, desperate need to find shelter before the cold claimed them. Dr. Phineas Fairbanks arrived with his wife, both of them frostbitten and exhausted. Their home had run out of firewood on the third day of the storm, and the cold had crept in like a living thing, driving them out into the blizzard in search of salvation. Reverend Josiah Whitmore and his wife Cordelia came next, their house damaged when a tree fell through the roof. They had spent hours in prayer before accepting that God's answer might come in the form of a widow's hay barn. Friedrich Brenner fought his way through from his farmstead, his beard encased in ice, his fingers so numb he could barely grip the barn door. Prudence Olson arrived alone, her face blank with shock. Her husband had gone to check on livestock 3 days ago and never returned. She did not weep. She was too cold for tears. Waylon Tanner, the young man who had bet $20 on Delphina's death, came crawling through the snow on the 5th day. He said nothing when Delphina opened the door. He did not need to. The frostbite on his cheeks spoke louder than any words. Delphina counted them in her mind as they arrived. Herself, Greta, the 3 Hensleys, Dr. Fairbanks and his wife, Reverend Whitmore and Cordelia, Friedrich Brenner, Prudence Olson, and Waylon Tanner. 12 people, one small room, one chance at survival. The space that had seemed adequate for Delphina alone now felt impossibly small. Bodies pressed against bodies. Breath fogged the air despite the stove's warmth. The temperature inside dropped as more people entered, as the door opened and closed, as the cold fought to reclaim its victims. But the hay walls held, the stove burned, and slowly, impossibly, the temperature crept back up. Delphina organized them with quiet efficiency. She showed them where to sit, how to arrange themselves to maximize warmth. She rationed her food stores, calculating how long they could last with 12 mouths to feed instead of one. "We sleep in shifts," she announced, 4 at a time on the bed platform, the rest sitting or lying on the floor. "We keep the stove fed constantly. We do not open the outer door for any reason." No one argued. No one questioned her authority. They were too cold, too frightened, too grateful to be alive. On the 6th day, with the storm still howling outside and the thermometer in the barn reading 47 below zero, they huddled together in the hay house and talked. There was nothing else to do. The darkness pressed in around them, broken only by the glows of the stove and the single lamp Delphina kept burning to ward off despair. "I have never been this frightened," Cordelia Whitmore admitted quietly. "Even during the Indian scares, even during the drought years, I never believed I might die." "None of us did," her husband said. "We thought we understood this land. We thought we knew what it could do." "No one knows what nature can do," old Greta Lindqvist said from her corner. "We think we are masters of this world. We are not. We are guests, and sometimes the host reminds us who holds the power." Delphina said little. She tended the stove, checked the walls for any sign of damage, monitored their dwindling food supplies. But she listened to everything, and she watched the faces of those who had mocked her just weeks ago. Orrin Hensley caught her eye across the crowded space. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw the shame written clearly on his face. Word reached them on that same day that shattered any remaining illusions about the scope of this disaster. A young man named Tobias Crawford had stumbled to the barn hours earlier, more dead than alive, having traveled from Hickory Ridge. Now, as he recovered enough to speak, he shared what he knew. "Harlan Marsh is dead," Tobias said, his voice hoarse and cracking. "He tried to make it to Lincoln in his carriage. They found the horses frozen a mile outside of town. Found Marsh 100 yards further on, still holding his money box, frozen solid." No one spoke. Delphina felt something complicated move through her chest. Not joy exactly, not satisfaction. Something more like the closing of a chapter, the settling of an account she had not known was still open. "How many others?" she asked quietly. "We do not know yet. Many. The Sanderson family, all 6 of them. Old Mr. Pettigrew from the general store. The Miller twins." Tobias's voice broke. "So many." Cordelia Whitmore began to weep softly. Her husband put his arm around her and murmured prayers that seemed too small for the enormity of what they faced. Word came about Cornelius Blackwood, too. He had barricaded himself in his fine house with plenty of firewood and supplies. He had survived alone, speaking to no one, refusing to open his door to anyone who came seeking shelter. 3 people had frozen to death on his porch, but the storm was not finished with them yet. On the 6th day, the wind reached a pitch that Delphina would remember for the rest of her life. The barn walls shuddered, the hay house trembled. For one terrible moment, she believed everything would come apart, that the storm would finally claim them all, despite her preparations. Then the moment passed. The walls held, the hay held. Her father's knowledge, passed down across half a century and 1,000 miles, held. When she checked the thermometer that evening, the exterior temperature had dropped to 47 below zero. Inside the hay house, surrounded by 12 frightened people and 1 patient dog, the temperature remained at 49 degrees. The hay house had saved them. Against all odds, against all predictions, against the mockery and doubt of everyone who had seen it, the hay house had saved them. 12 people are now crammed into a tiny hay house built by a widow everyone thought was crazy. Outside, the worst storm in Nebraska history is still raging, 47 degrees below zero. Will they survive? Comment below with your prediction, and do not forget to hit that like button. On the morning of January 15th, Delphina woke to something she had almost forgotten existed. Silence. The wind had stopped. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the absence of sound, not quite believing it was real. Around her, others were stirring, lifting their heads, looking around with expressions of confused hope. "Is it over?" Cordelia Whitmore whispered. "I think so," her husband replied. "Dear God, I think it is over." Delphina rose carefully, stepping over sleeping bodies, and made her way to the barn doors. She lifted the latch and pushed. The door would not move. She pushed harder. Still nothing. "The snow," Friedrich Brenner said, understanding immediately. "We are buried." It took them 2 hours to dig their way out, passing buckets of snow from hand to hand, excavating a tunnel through the white mass that had accumulated against the barn doors. When they finally broke through into the outside world, what they saw stole their breath. The prairie had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow lay everywhere, 4 feet deep in the open areas, drifted to 10 or 12 feet against buildings and fences. The sky above was a brilliant, heartless blue, as if the storm had never happened. The sun blazed down on a landscape of pure white, so bright it hurt to look at. And everywhere, the evidence of destruction. Trees snapped like twigs, fences buried or torn apart, buildings collapsed under the weight of snow, or torn apart by wind. Cattle frozen where they stood, preserved in ice like grotesque statues. One by one, the survivors emerged from the hay barn and looked upon what the storm had wrought. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process the magnitude of what they were seeing. Orrin Hensley's house was gone. Not collapsed, not damaged. Gone. The wind had taken it apart board by board, scattering the pieces across a quarter-mile of prairie. Dr. Fairbanks's house still stood, but one wall had caved in, and the interior was filled with snow. Everything inside was ruined. Reverend Whitmore's church, the solid wooden structure that had stood for 15 years, had lost its roof entirely. The pews inside were buried under snow. They walked through the devastation in a daze, taking stock, counting losses. 23 people dead in the immediate area alone. More than half the cattle in the county frozen. Buildings destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The infrastructure of a community laid waste in 6 days. But 12 people who had sheltered in a hay house built by a widow were alive. That evening they gathered in the barn, not in the hay house this time, but in the open space of the barn itself, which seemed vast and empty now that the crisis had passed. Delphina had started a fire in the middle of the floor, the smoke rising through the same gaps that had once let in starlight. Orrin Hensley stood slowly, his face haggard, his eyes red from exhaustion and emotion. He looked at Delphina for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Ashworth," he began, his voice rough, "I owe you an apology. We all do." The others shifted uncomfortably, but no one contradicted him. "I called you mad," he continued. "I said you had lost your mind along with your husband. I told you that building a house from hay was the most foolish thing I had ever seen. I said you would freeze to death or burn alive." He paused, his jaw working as he struggled with words that clearly did not come easily. I was wrong. We were all wrong. And when my house collapsed, when my wife was dying in my arms, it was your hay pile that saved us. His voice cracked, and he did not try to hide it. I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could save my family. I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. Delphina stood very still, feeling the eyes of everyone upon her. She had imagined this moment, in the dark hours of doubt, when the mockery had been loudest. She had imagined what she would say, how she would respond to an admission that she had been right all along. Now that the moment had arrived, she found that vindication felt nothing like she had expected. My father taught me, she said quietly, Gideon Stokes of Pennsylvania. He built a hay house when I was 12 years old. He said it was the warmest house he ever lived in. She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who had doubted her, pitied her, predicted her death. I watched him build it. I remembered. That is all. Dr. Fairbanks stepped forward, his scientific mind clearly still processing what he had experienced. I dismissed the insulation properties because I had never seen them applied this way, he said slowly. My education taught me to trust only what I had studied. Your father's wisdom taught you to trust what actually works. He shook his head, wonder and chagrin mixed in his expression. It is not madness. It is engineering. Ancient engineering that I, with all my education, failed to recognize. Reverend Whitmore clasped his hands together as if in prayer. I offered to pray for her soul. I should have been asking her to teach me. The Lord provides wisdom in many forms, and I was too blind to see it. One by one they spoke, each in their own way acknowledging what they had failed to see, what they had been too proud or too certain to consider, each offering some form of apology, some admission of error. Waylon Tanner stood last, his young face still marked by the frostbite that would scar him for life. I bet $20 you would not survive, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I laughed at you. I slapped your walls to see if they would fall. He swallowed hard. You saved my life, Mrs. Ashworth, and I do not deserve it. Delphina listened to all of it. She accepted their words with grace, without gloating, without reminding them of the specific things they had said. What would be the point? They knew what they had said. They would remember it for the rest of their lives. When the last person had spoken, she addressed them all. Knowledge does not always come from books or degrees, she said. Sometimes it comes from watching and remembering and trusting those who came before us. My father learned about hay houses from his father, who learned it from his father before him. This knowledge came across oceans and generations to reach me here. She looked at the walls of the barn, at the hay house visible in the corner, at the small structure that had held back the worst storm Nebraska had ever seen. We do not have to reinvent everything. Sometimes the old ways still work. Sometimes they work better than anything we could devise with all our modern learning. The trick is knowing which knowledge to trust and having the courage to trust it when everyone around you says you are wrong. The fire crackled in the silence that followed her words. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. They were alive. Against all odds, against the fury of nature itself, they had survived. And they would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Spring came slowly to Nebraska that year, as if the land itself needed time to recover from what it had endured. The snow melted in patches, revealing the full extent of the disaster. More bodies were found as the drifts receded. More destroyed buildings emerged from their white shrouds. More cattle carcasses dotted the prairie, grim monuments to the storm's indiscriminate fury. But alongside the evidence of destruction, something else was emerging. Something new. Delphina's hay house had become famous. Word had spread through the territory and beyond. Newspapers in Lincoln and Omaha had printed the story of the widow who had survived the Great Blizzard in a house built from hay. Agricultural journals had sent correspondents to examine her construction techniques. Curious visitors arrived daily, wanting to see for themselves the structure that had saved 12 lives. More importantly, people wanted to learn. Orrin Hensley was the first. He came to Delphina's barn on a morning in late March, his hat in his hands, his face wearing an expression she had never seen on it before. Humility. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I am rebuilding my house, and I want to build it from hay." She could have refused. She could have reminded him of his mockery, his certainty, his contempt. Instead, she simply nodded. "Come inside, I will show you how." She taught him everything her father had taught her: how to select and position the bales, how to stagger them for stability, how to plaster the walls with mud and straw, how to create chimney clearances that would not catch fire, how to seal doors and windows to trap the precious heat. Oren listened with an attention he had never shown before. He took notes, he asked questions, he practiced under her guidance until his hands knew the work as well as his mind understood it. When he left, others came to take his place. Friedrich Brenner arrived next, then Dr. Fairbanks, then young Ephraim Hensley, who had survived the storm and now wanted to document everything he could about the technique that had saved his family. Through the spring and summer of 1887, Delphina taught anyone who wanted to learn. She charged nothing. She turned no one away. She shared the knowledge her father had given her as freely as he had shared it with her. 7 hay houses were built in the area that year. 7 families who had lost their homes in the blizzard found shelter in structures made from the same prairie grass that surrounded them. 7 families who would survive the next winter and the winter after that in warmth that conventional construction could not match. Ephraim Hensley compiled his notes into a detailed guide. He documented every step of the construction process, every measurement, every technique. He drew diagrams and wrote explanations in clear, simple language that anyone could follow. "This needs to be preserved," he told Delphina one autumn afternoon. "This knowledge should not die with us." "It will not," she assured him. "Knowledge shared is knowledge that lives forever." The years passed and Delphina remained in her hay barn. She could have built a conventional house. She had the money now, earned through carpentry work and teaching fees that she had initially refused, but eventually accepted at the insistence of grateful students. She could have moved to town where life would have been easier and loneliness less constant. But Providence House was her home. It was where she had survived the worst winter of her life. It was where she had proved that a widow with nothing but hay and memory could prevail against a world that had written her off. In 1889, the bank that had once taken everything from her offered to sell back her original homestead. The property had sat empty for years, the clapboard house deteriorating without care, the glass windows broken, the stone fireplace cold and dark. Delphina visited the property once. She walked through the rooms where she had lived with Ezra, where they had dreamed their dreams and planned their future. She touched the walls they had built together, the door frame he had carved with wheat sheaves. Then she walked away. "That house was my past," she told Ephraim Hensley, who had accompanied her. "Providence House is my future. The old house held memories. This one holds lives saved. There is no comparison." By 1895, there were 34 hay houses in the region, 34 families living in structures that used the principles Delphina had learned from her father and passed on to her neighbors. The technique had spread beyond the immediate area, carried by travelers and documented in agricultural publications. The Nebraska Agricultural Extension Service sent researchers to study the construction method. They measured insulation values and fuel consumption. They compared hay houses to conventional timber structures and found that the hay houses outperformed them by a factor of 2.3 in heat retention. "Ancient engineering," one researcher wrote in his report, "proves superior to modern construction in key metrics of thermal efficiency." Delphina read the report with quiet satisfaction. Her father would have been proud. Copper died in the spring of 1891, passing peacefully in his sleep beside the stove he had come to love. He was 14 years old, ancient for a hunting dog, and he had been faithful to the end. Delphina buried him beside the barn, beneath a wooden marker she carved herself. "Copper Ashworth," it read, "the most faithful friend through the darkest winter, 1877 to 1891. She wept as she had not wept since Ezra's death. Then she dried her tears and continued living, because that was what Copper would have wanted. That was what Ezra would have wanted. That was what she wanted, in the core of her being, where grief could not quite reach. A few months later, one of Copper's descendants came to live with her, a pup from his final litter, born the spring before he died. She named her Maple for the rich brown color of her coat and the barn was no longer quite so quiet. The years continued their march, and Delphina grew old within the walls of Providence House. She taught until she could no longer teach, until the arthritis in her hands made demonstration impossible, and the weakness in her legs made standing for long periods a trial. But even then, she advised. She consulted. She answered questions from anyone who asked. Ephraim Hensley visited her regularly, bringing his children and eventually his grandchildren to meet the woman who had saved his family during the Great Blizzard. He read her his latest writings about hay construction, asked her opinion on improvements and modifications that builders had developed on over the years. "You started something remarkable," he told her one afternoon in the autumn of 1901. "When you built that first hay house, you were not just saving yourself. You were giving us all a new way to live." Delphina smiled, her face creased with the lines of a life fully lived. "My father started it," she said. "I just remembered." On a quiet morning in March of 1902, Delphina Ashworth did not wake up. She was 66 years old. She had lived through the death of her husband, the loss of her home, the worst blizzard in Nebraska history, and the transformation of her desperate survival into a legacy that would outlast them all. She was found by Ephraim Hensley, who had come to check on her as he did every few days. She lay peacefully in her bed, maple curled at her feet, her mother's Bible open on the pillow beside her. The stove had burned down to embers, but the hay walls still held their warmth, keeping her body comfortable even after life had left it. They buried her beside Ezra in the small cemetery outside Hickory Ridge. The entire town came to the funeral. People who had known her, people who had learned from her, people who had survived because of her. They stood in the spring sunshine and listened to Reverend Whitmore's son, who had taken over his father's congregation, speak words of tribute and remembrance. Delphina Ashworth was called many things in her life, the young reverend said. Mad, foolish, a grieving widow who had lost touch with reality. But she was none of those things. She was wed. She was brave. She was a woman who trusted the knowledge passed down to her and had the courage to act on that trust when everyone around her said she was wrong. He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. 12 people survived the Great Blizzard of 1887 because of her. 34 families are living in homes she helped them build. Countless more will benefit from the knowledge she preserved and shared. That is her legacy. That is what she leaves behind. After the funeral, Ephraim Hensley went to the barn that had been Delphina's home for 16 years. He walked around Providence House one last time, running his hands over the mud-plastered walls, feeling the warmth that still radiated from within. Then he began to write. He wrote everything he knew, everything Delphina had taught him, everything he had learned from watching her work and listening to her explain. He compiled decades of notes into a comprehensive guide, complete with diagrams and measurements and step-by-step instructions. The document he produced would be used for generations. It would be studied by agricultural scientists and architecture historians. It would influence building codes and inspire new approaches to sustainable construction. But Ephraim titled it simply, The Wisdom of Delphina Ashworth, How to Build a Hay House. Providence House stood for another 40 years after Delphina's death. The Nebraska State Historical Society preserved it in 1928, recognizing its significance as a surviving example of frontier ingenuity and a monument to the Great Blizzard of 1887. Visitors came from across the country to see the hay house that had saved 12 lives, to touch the walls that a widow had built with her own hands, to understand how simple materials and ancient knowledge had prevailed against impossible odds. In 1942, a fire finally claimed the old barn that had sheltered Providence House for so long. The hay structure within, dry after decades, went up quickly. By the time the fire brigade arrived, there was nothing left to save. But the knowledge survived. Ephraim Hensley's guide survived. The principles that Gideon Stokes had taught his daughter, that Delphina had taught her neighbors, that those neighbors had taught their children and grandchildren, all of that survived. Today, a bronze plaque marks the spot where Providence House once stood. It reads, "Here stood the house that saved 12 lives in the Great Blizzard of 1887, built by Delphina Ashworth, a widow with nothing but hay, memory, and courage. Her knowledge, passed down from her father Gideon Stokes, preserved warmth when the cold wanted death. She taught freely, she shared completely. She proved that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones, and that wisdom can come from places the educated never think to look. Below the main inscription, in smaller letters, are the words Delphina herself spoke on the night when her former critics gathered in her barn to acknowledge their error. Knowledge does not always come from books or degrees. Sometimes it comes from watching and remembering and trusting those who came before us. And so ends the story of Delphina Ashworth in Providence House. A woman who lost everything found a way to survive using knowledge passed down from her father. She was mocked, doubted, and predicted to fail. But when the worst storm in Nebraska history struck, her simple hay house proved stronger than the finest timber construction. She saved 12 lives and left a legacy that continues to inspire. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes we all need to be reminded that wisdom comes in unexpected forms, that the simple solutions are often the best, and that a single person with courage and knowledge can make a difference that lasts for generations. Thank you for watching until the end. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. And remember what Delphina taught us. Warmth does not come from fine things or big houses. It comes from what you know, what you remember, and what you are willing to build with your own hands.